Welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today's Thursday, July 13th, 2023. I'm Brad Eli here with the two co-hosts, Simon Rafe and Christine Niles. And join us in the notorious fourth chair is Big Dave Gordon. Hey, Dave.
How's it going, Brad?
Archbishop Victor Manuel Tucho Fernandez of Argentina has been the subject of many headlines recently. Pope Francis recently appointed him to be the next prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, the office that acts as the theological watchdog for the Holy See. Since he's from Argentina, he's got close ties to our current pontiff. But Archbishop Fernandez has been marred by several public scandals, including most infamously a strange book about kissing. Why don't we start there, Christine? The kissing archbishop and his catechism on kissing.
Yeah, it's very strange. It's called Heal Me With Your Mouth, and the entire thing, every single chapter, you can actually read the whole thing online, is about various aspects of kissing. Now, he claims he wrote it many, many years ago, and he was trying to reach out to the teens and catechize them, and essentially it was supposed to be this sort of theological analysis to the kiss, the divine kiss, of Christ coming to earth and that sort of thing, and, uniting us with him. So I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. He's trying to catechize to the youth, but there are problematic portions of this book. I mean, it's not the way I would go around evangelizing things. It's not something you would expect from an archbishop, because there are some semi-erotic pictures in there, and it includes portions of his own poetry that's really strange. Like, there's one line that actually includes the B word, referring to somebody, I find the whole thing really strange, okay? But so he wrote it decades ago, and like I said, Pope Francis has defended him, saying that this was just his way of trying to catechize the youth. But yeah, it's strange. It's very strange.
Well, if I have some extra time sometime, I will look up a PDF version of that and maybe go there. And
it's kind of interesting. I mean,
kind of busy these days.
Yeah, you're busy with these things. I think obviously it is kind of interesting because today, in the now, and I think it's probably at least sort of within the 20th century, kissing has become an erotic, or at the very least a romantic gesture and a romantic notion. Now, historically, of course, going back several hundred years, the idea of kissing was not necessarily so romantic. I mean, we do see, of course, within some kind of early catechisms and scripture and so forth, there is a discussion of greet each other with a holy kiss, and at that point, of course, the kiss is not a romantic or an erotic gesture. Within the liturgy, some of the more traditional liturgy from the Tridentine Mass, there's actually gestures there, such as within the distribution of palms, where on Palm Sunday, where the hand of the celebrant will be kissed, and again, that's not a romantic gesture. It's a gesture of loyalty and affirmation and so forth. Sometimes there's a pious tradition. If you drop a blessed or a sacramental item on the floor, you will actually pick it up and you will kiss it as kind of a reparation for having dropped it on the floor. So obviously there is that tradition of kissing being non-erotic and non-romantic, but certainly, I mean, obviously this man, certainly he's a cardinal, so he's probably in his 70s or his 80s at most. He wrote this decades ago. Within the context of kissing being a very romantic thing, I think at the very least it's like this is not something that you should necessarily rely on and go, well, back in the 14th century, it's like, my brother in Christ, we don't live in the 14th century anymore.
Just to jump in there just for a second, he's a cardinal-elect right now, so in September he'll get his red hat, so go ahead.
So the book didn't land, right? I mean, I can excuse a lame book, and I've not read the book, so I'm gonna, I've heard reports that it's not the best. Obviously, I defer, in fact, to my trusted colleagues here, and I take what you know of it at face value. But so he wrote a lame book. That's ultimately not that big of an issue. Ultimately, what matters is his faithfulness today. Now, obviously, the past is often prologue, and what we do in the past reflects at least a state of mind, barring some, road to Damascus conversion, generally who you are in your youth reflects, at least loosely, who you are as an older adult. So it could be seen perhaps as a warning flag, but if those were the only issues, I think we'd be like, okay, so he wrote a silly book.
Well, the problem, those aren't exactly the only issues.
Right.
That was just the first layer of the onion that causes the eyes to tear up. Before we get on to the present, which oftentimes we would lead to the present here, but we're already in the past there, he has some skeletons in his closet, some bones, especially with Pope Francis' zero tolerance. Once again, another guy who wasn't exactly zero tolerant from his past has some bones clacking together.
That's actually more concerning to me, is that he's being accused of sex abuse cover-up back in his diocese of La Plata. It's concerning a priest named Father Lorenzo in 2019. Allegations came forward against him from an alleged victim claiming that he was abused back in 2008. And according to abuse advocates, victim advocates, they said that Bishop Fernandez at the time publicly defended Father Lorenzo against these claims, saying that they were slander, etc. But then more allegations came out, and he still left Fernandez in his place as a parish priest. And it wasn't until I think about 5 total victims came forward that he finally, many months later, finally removed him from the parish. So a lot of people are accusing him of, you protected a priest, you publicly defended an abuser. Now, to be fair to him, he was asked, did you cover up sex abuse? He is claiming he did not. He's categorically denying it. To Catholic News article agency, this is what he said, that as new testimonies appeared, the Archbishop was taking new measures, beginning by prohibiting him, the priest, from all activities with minors until confining him in a Caritas department, said the spokesperson. At the beginning, it was only a matter of reopening a criminal and canonical investigation that had been closed years before. Subsequently, other new testimonies appeared and new measures were taken for them. So that's what he's claiming, that he did indeed take appropriate measures. He was confining him more and more as new testimonies appeared. But according to the victims, they're saying, well, that's not what happened. He defended him publicly in the beginning. He left him in place. So the reason it's so concerning is he's now head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And this is the dicastery that is tasked with judging and then imposing penalties upon sex abusers. So people are wondering, is he going to be up to the task of doing this?
Well, he himself said, no, I'm not up to that task. I don't really know how to do that. And the Pope said, well, that's a different department of this dicastery, so you don't have to worry about that. Well, ultimately, you're still over the whole dicastery itself.
Over the department. I mean, what I would be most concerned about is when you come along and you say, to defend somebody, to come out and say, okay, one of my priests has been accused of some hideous crime. Doesn't necessarily need to be sex abuse. Just could be, dipping into the collection plate. Could be, drinking the communion wine. It could be anything. You've been accused of some crime, and to come out and say, well, I'm defending the man, saying I do not believe the allegations. To say that that these are not within the pattern of behavior that I've come to expect from him. I do not think a man of I know him and he wouldn't do that. Obviously, okay, that's a very human response, and it is a very human response. That's not the response that it should be from the bishop, who is his boss, who is his supervisor, who is his spiritual father, and also the spiritual father of all of the people in the diocese. There should be a much more neutral response at that point, because your voice carries a great degree of weight, and equally, you can't be throwing around words such as slander, as the 2 lawyers will tell me on this panel. Slander has a meaning. To say, well, these accusations are slanderous. Okay, so the people who made them are liars. The people who made them are deliberately attacking this person. The people who are making these allegations are coming with malfeasance and malice towards this. Those are very real claims being made negatively against the people who are making those claims. That's not a thing that you should be doing as the bishop doing that. If you do it as a private individual, we saw this with the Father Jackson case, when many people came up and they were private individuals and they said, well, I think these allegations are untrue, these are deliberate fabrications and so forth. Okay, as a private individual, who cares? It's in your conscience there. You don't carry a lot of weight. But when you're the bishop, that is a very irresponsible, at best, irresponsible thing to do.
Yeah, there's several times he's been in the media recently giving interviews to different people, and he basically is admitting, just like the same line with many of these bishops, well, I didn't do things the way I would have now. In hindsight, I would have done things differently. Number two, well, we didn't really do things that way back then. It wasn't exactly spelled out that way. He says, well, if I broke the law, I don't really know if I broke the law or not. But so these things are really problematic. And he actually told the Holy Father, well, I'm really not up to the task of handling sex abuse cases. And the Holy Father writes to him and says, well, you don't have to worry about that. I'll have that in another department of that. But you're still over the whole thing. And it's so problematic. Like, that's what the CDF does. It's CDF, now it's DDF instead of Congregation Doctrine of the Faith. It's dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. But that's what that does in belief and in practice, what's going on there. So for you not to have be the full package there is very problematic. And we'll get into the whole second half of the show. We're building up problems here and reasons why you want to jump ship and maybe shoot yourself in the head twice with your left hand or something. But don't do that. It gets better later.
Just to add, if you have an executive with a certain outlook or mindset or predilection for something, then generally, even if he's not directly overseeing something, that trickles down because the buck stops with the executive. But to pivot for a moment here to something equally as important and perhaps more because he's tasked with defending the deposit of faith. We've heard talk of perhaps blessing gay unions. Obviously, Fernandez has come out and said, to his great credit, to his minimal credit, the church's teaching on gay marriage, which is that it's wrong, that it would be sinful, essentially that it's a non-existent thing. But he's also speculated about the possibility in the future of blessing gay unions, saying, quote, if a blessing to same-sex couples is given in such a way that there will be no confusion, it will have to be the subject of analysis and confirmation. So he's essentially saying that if a blessing of a same-sex union will not be in some way distorted or misunderstood to be akin to a blessing of a marriage or a marriage itself, then we can consider this and dialogue on it. And we all know what that means. Generally, when there's consideration and dialogue about one of these issues that's been part and parcel of the progressive cardinals and bishops' agenda for a long time, it usually means it's kind of a foregone conclusion, and they're going to shoehorn or ramrod their ideology in, their agenda in, and they're going to kind of retrofit it or back justify it. That's how these things work in the church. It's the tail wags the dog often with these progressive prelates. And I think I just want to say before I kick it to you guys for comment, I'm so sick of hearing this about gay unions that maybe there's some positive aspects, like there's monogamy in it. Well, first of all, generally no, but even if that were the case, there's commitment and fidelity and loyalty and monogamy and all that stuff. It's like saying, we should kind of praise the demons in hell because they're really loyal to Satan. They're like really good minions to him. They serve him. That's virtuous. No, it's an anti-virtue because they're being loyal and having great faith to their evil, intrinsically disordered faux union. So it's not worthy of praise. It's actually deserving of extra condemnation, just like the demon's loyalty, fidelity to Satan is.
Yeah, because it's the notion of taking something like fidelity, and obviously you use the example of the demons there, which I think is a very good one. It's actually made worse because it is a good thing. Loyalty is a virtue, and it is a virtue applied to a vice. So what you've actually managed to do is you haven't made the vice good, you've somehow managed to make the virtue bad at that point. When we talk about it, say, well, like the Nazis, Reinhard Heydrich, he was totally devoted to the cause of Nazism, and it's like, that is not a good thing. That is a bad thing.
Simon, why are you so close-minded? Can't we praise the Antichrist for his devotion to the reign of Satan?
No, Fernandez gave an idea of exactly where he was going to come from as head of the GDF. When he accepted this promotion from the Pope, he wrote that he accepted it with joy. Even though I will have many who will be against me, there are people who prefer a more rigid, structured way of thinking, at war with the world. And even Pope Francis, when he was writing to Archbishop Fernandez asking him to take this position, he said, I don't want someone who is like a desk-bound theologian with cold, rigid way of thinking, looking at the world. We need someone to be more open. And so it's this approach, of wanting to find the positive in gay unions. But the fact is, the church is supposed to be the sentinel that stands guard against the evils and the filth that are coming in and trying to make way. You're supposed to stand guard and say, stop, this is wrong. And yes, people will hate you for it, and yes, you'll be crucified for it. But that's not the attitude we seem to be getting from Archbishop Fernandez. And unfortunately, not too much from this pontificate either. There seems to be, to give him credit, he has stood against, like contraception and women priests, things like that. So it's not 100% black and white, but still, there is this attitude of, let's be more open to things. It's a little more fluid. Let's.
Well, what Francis is doing, this is an interesting thing. You see Francis, and Francis will come out and he says statements, and on any single one of these, big headline doctrines, you can find from Francis a statement which is very clear and utterly unequivocal and totally and 100% orthodox. You have to go looking for it because the Catholic media in general doesn't report it, and he doesn't say them in his headline public speeches. But Pope Francis, absolutely, you can find him saying that gay marriage is demonic, which I think is probably a stronger statement than I've heard from practically anyone else. You can have him saying the door is closed on women's ordination. All of these things, he comes out and says this. Here's the problem. Pope Francis surrounds himself with people. He picks people. And this is to your point, Dave, when you say the character of the executive is reflected in his executors. That what you have is Francis who's saying, I want the confusion. And it seems the way he does the confusion is by having these people who say, at the very least, confusing things surround him. He appoints these people, he chooses these people, they come up and they are placed in these positions, such as Fernandez, such as, obviously Father James Martin has not been given some, cardinal's hat, thank God. Oh gosh, I've given Francis an idea. But he is given audiences and he's given, these handwritten letters and so forth. And Father Martin is at the very least causing a great degree of confusion. In this way, you've got Francis who himself, it's like, okay, he seems to be a personally orthodox kind of guy, similar in ways to Donald Trump. Obviously we don't want to turn everything, into like a kind of political discussion, but Donald Trump had all these great ideas, had all these great notions. He's going to drain the swamp. He's going to clean up Washington, all this sort of stuff. What did he do? He surrounded himself with a right bunch of numpties, left, right, and center. People
Christie.
like Chris Christie, Bolton, right? Donald Trump has the distinction, I think, of being the only president in the last 60 years or something to have not started any new foreign wars. Well, it's not because of John Bolton not trying. John Bolton never met a foreign war he didn't want to get involved in. But again, you see, it's the same sort of thing. You've got a good person who does good things themselves, and these people surround themselves with a right bunch of Charlies.
And that's why we'd want to, a lot of these stories have been picked up by the right-wing factions in the church and actually embellished and made more of, and we really lose sight of what the problem is. A lot of it is administrative, okay? And even, let's go back to the Abu Dhabi statement, because we talk about fuzzy statements, and God wills or blessed, God wills all religions. And that really caused quite a stir. A lot of people were trying to get their head around, a lot of armchair theologians out there saying, well, obviously that's a straight up heresy. So, and then the whole thing starts rolling out, well, if it's a heresy, then he's no longer the Catholic and in the church, and he's no longer the Pope, and da-da-da, it rolls out, whoa, pump the brakes. What happened was in 2022, Bishop Schneider cornered him in Kazakhstan when he came there in September. Not much really reported about it, and said, okay, what do you mean when you say, because Schneider made a big deal of it back in the day, he said, what do you mean when God wills all religions? Do you mean God's actively willing those, like that's God's, good will of good pleasure, that he intends that from the beginning, or that this consequential will that God permits? I mean, at that level, God allows the devil, God wills the devil, because if he didn't will the devil in existence or hold him in existence, he would go out of existence, right? So all of us have free will. All of us have committed sins with our free will, St. John says, and therefore God allows us to do that. God permits that. That's God's permissive will. Well, lo and behold, Pope Francis
Pope Francis
says, oh yeah, I was talking about the permissive will. But nobody talks about that. We did on Rome Dispatch. We brought that clarification up there. So then we said, well, okay, the problem there is then not heresy, right? The problem is you let it go 3 years before you clarified something. That's the pastoral problem. And I can't laud you for that. I can understand that maybe it wasn't a heresy and you had some intention in mind that God just allows free will here, you know, and then all the error that comes out of free will has to be allowed too, because God can't force you to love him. So God has to allow your will to be free. Otherwise, you're not free to love him. So, but why did you wait 3 years to clarify it?
And why did you clarify it in a Central Asian republic? The only reason people can find Kazakhstan on a map is because when you put the pin in Central Asia somewhere, Kazakhstan is so huge that you invariably hear Kazakhstan. But seriously, most people, no idea where Kazakhstan is. This Kazakhstan is not, you know, some situation where people are going to be hanging desperately on what Pope Francis says.
Afghanistan and Russia, okay?
Yeah, which is why I don't understand why everybody's lauding Bishop Schneider as like the authority on various things. I mean, it's a very small diocese, and in any case,
he's not even the ordinary, I don't think, is he? Or did he get promoted?
He's an auxiliary there.
He's an auxiliary of Astana.
But I think your example, Brad, brings up the crucial point of why we as Catholics in charity need to extend the benefit of the doubt to the Holy Father. And sometimes it feels like it's the exact opposite now, especially in a lot of the more traditionalist media, where it's almost as if people are wanting to find heresy in the words of Pope Francis. It's like they're looking for it, they're hunting for it, and then as soon as something appears that even might seem quasi-heretical, they just blare it breathlessly from the rooftops and don't actually seek to find out exactly what he said.
100%. There are going to be so many people, because of this pontificate especially, which I'm not going to sit here and lie, hasn't vexed me some or caused me some consternation or trouble. It has, but I think largely most of the problems that we've heard trumped up have been canards, have been false. Now there are some issues that are hard to get around. Amoris Laetitia, footnote 351, the death penalty, some of the softness on people like James Martin, giving him free rein and seeming to give him papal imprimatur to spread his errors, things of that ilk. But when we actually get down to it, many of the times the trad media has grifted, and you know, because it fills their coffers. People want to donate when you go out and you attack the Pope. It's really popular, it's sexy, it makes headlines, yada, yada, yada. They've used it to their benefit, and they've spread lies and falsehoods about him, haven't given him the filial benefit of the doubt to which he is entitled, not with one or two statements, but each statement taken anew has to be interpreted in a light most favorable to the sitting vicar of Christ, and people are not extending that, not even courtesy, but duty to him. They hear something reported in the media, they take it in the least charitable way, the most extreme way, and then they go write a toxic, whining article about it with a link for donations and probably a petition so they can expand their email list. It's disgusting, and I think a lot of people that are being lauded right now as heroes, and you know, people in the comments section, by the way, their keyboards are like smoking, like, oh, Dave, you know, you're soft on Francis. Yeah, I'm a son of the church. But a lot of the people that are popularly lauded as heroes, these talking head pimps in the trad Catholic world, they're going to have a lot to answer for at Judgment Day.
And let's just be completely honest. The reason that some of these Catholic figures are out there trumpeting the so-called, you know, heresy of Pope Francis and, oh, this is the latest thing, the reason that some of them are doing it is because they really don't think he's the vicar of Christ. But they will not come out and say it. Now, some people have come out and said it, but I do, you know, some of them I do know for a fact are privately sedevacantists, but they will not come out and say it. But what they will do instead is they will push this program of doubt. You know, like, here's another thing the Pope said. Is he really the Pope? You know, oh, and here's another thing. And they just keep doing this over and over and over again so that there's sufficient doubts in Catholics' minds created so that they start doubting his validity as well. But it's because they themselves, I know for a fact, some of these people, and some of them are very, very well-known people, pushing the doubt about Francis because they themselves are truly sedevacantist, but they don't have the courage or the honesty to come out and say, yep, this is where I stand, because they know they're going to lose their subscribers and followers.
And when you report falsely on something that later gets clarified, you have a duty to retract.
Yes.
You have a duty to go before people, and I'm guilty of this myself. I'll call myself out right now, because it turns out it seems like what was happening at the Amazonian Synod, where there was the so-called Pachamama worship. It turns out, and Lofton did a great expose on this, interview on this, it seems like that was not Pachamama worship after all.
I mean, talking about the Vatican Gardens
The
specifically.
Vatican Gardens specifically. Yeah. And, I wrote an article in the wake of that, like calling us out, saying that, there needs to be anger that like cries to heaven for vengeance for idolatry in the Vatican. I got that wrong. I was wrong. I have egg on my face. Everybody who makes a mistake in writing or reporting on especially the Pope, the magisterium, it's like if you're going to criticize the magisterium and the Pope, and sometimes we have a calling to do that in order to, out of love for Christ and out of love for the bark of Peter, but if you're going to do it, you better make sure you're right. No one is going, when you're judged and you get up to St. Peter and Christ at the throne of Christ, you can always say, I listened to the shepherds you gave me, and if I was wrong and I erred, like I had a wrong take on the death penalty because Pope Francis's prudential judgment turned out to be wrong, you can, that is something where Christ is going to say, well, these are the shepherds I gave you, you were listening, you were trying to be faithful, you were in, invincible ignorance on this. But if you're going to the mat for saying something that is irresponsible or wrong, or where you have vincible ignorance, then you're going to have to answer for that. And the people who have big platforms who are saying this, especially the cynical con men who are saying things they don't believe in order to fill their coffers with donations from the gullible public, they're going to have a lot to answer for.
So the scriptural passage here with Fernandez, and in light those who actually would promote such gay blessings or blessings of gay unions and stuff, where it's Ezekiel chapter 33, and it says, let me get there. So let me see here.
Tell Brad's not a Protestant because he doesn't have the entire Bible memorized.
I've made you a watchman. Let me see here. The wicked depart, none of his sins, and if they say, okay. Now, I've made you a watchman. If I say to the just man, the wicked man, you'll surely die, and he do penance for it. If the wicked man restore that, he shall live. But if you do not warn him of his evil, then he'll die in his blood. But I'll require his blood at your hands. So this is the problem here of scandal, and I keep going back to this scandal, is when it doesn't affect me personally as a Catholic. Do I have a problem when I go into a math class and the teachers, I know 2 + 2 is 4. And a new teacher's coming up there and says, 2 + 2 might be 3.5. This guy's like, hey, that guy say it's 3.5. Well, I thought the last guy said it was 5 or something. I don't have a problem with that. But the people that I talk to who don't know math very well do have a problem with that. So when we're running into young people out there, they go, oh, well, Pope Francis is all for gay marriage. Well, it makes it harder to evangelize people who have weak knowledge of the faith, who have weak faith in general. It's not a burden for me, per se. I don't come to, get, all bent out of shape that this particular pastor or that particular priest. I was in the underbelly of the church for 22 years. I know all about, just because you have, you're anointed or you're a priest or a bishop or whatever, absolutely doesn't mean holiness whatsoever. And it means you're even a bigger target, so you're probably going to be having a lot more times when the devil's going to take a shot at you. So the problem is, you as a Catholic have to live your faith, regardless of the Bishop Fernandez out here. They may even give some mealy mouth, say, well, now we can, if some pastor thinks and some bishop will allow them in their some diocese. They're already doing it in Germany. Pope hasn't even reined that in. So it's already here in some dioceses. We went through the same thing with Mors Laetitia. Well, some dioceses want to go ahead and allow divorced and remarried Catholics without annulments or anything else, just straight up divorced, remarried, civil marriages. And then even some Protestants were being allowed communion, and now, people, rainbow flags, I'm living a homosexual lifestyle, I can receive communion, and pro-abort politicians are receiving communion. That's on those guys. You need to pray for them and everything. And know that there's a whole lot more to answer for in those shepherds, and why you should be praying more for them, sacrificing more for them. But you yourself really jumping off ship or something because of what they're doing, you're not going to be there on their judgment day, and they're certainly not going to be there on your day of judgment. It's completely different, separate. You need to keep that separate all the time.
Yeah, and also, we talked about this before, but it's so unhealthy for people to constantly be focusing, especially on social media, on the latest thing that Pope Francis said. It's the age of social media. It's the age of the internet. We know with, like this, lightning speed, exactly what the Pope said on the plane, off-the-cuff comments, and then people start freaking out and just, typing this and that and just going nuts. And this wasn't how it was when Catholics lived in the Middle Ages. When you were in the Middle Ages, of course, no social media, nothing like that. And your life was basically your family. It was your community, your farm, your business, whatever it was, and your local parish. And that was it. You had no idea what the Pope was doing. He did not factor into your daily life at all. Maybe you prayed for him on your rosary, but that was it. You didn't even know what your bishop was doing necessarily. You were focused. That was your Catholic life. And I wish, in a sense, we could kind of return to something like that and not focus so much on every little thing the Pope said. What if we had social media back then? I bet people would be scandalized by things the Pope said back then. It's not a guarantee that just because you are elected Pope that you are necessarily the best catechized person in the world, especially with our seminary formation now. There are plenty of priests and bishops today who are not well catechized. They just don't understand the faith very well. I would count Pope Francis among those. He doesn't necessarily know the faith very well. So sometimes he will make off-the-cuff comments that just seem not right, okay? But they're not dogmatic. He's not issuing some dogmatic proclamation that somehow, changes the course of the... he can't do that anyway. But Catholics have this immediate reaction. He says something, doesn't sound right. Oh, he's a heretic, therefore he can't be the Pope.
Yeah,
people are going out of their way to be offended by things, and they're being used in a lot of senses as pawns, because as we said earlier, it is good for business if you go out and criticize the Pope, if you go out write a hit piece citing all kinds of unsupported, unsourced sensationalism to hit the Pope. That is a way to get people excited, and people are being used as pawns. And there's also a lack of self-awareness. You have people with a high school education or something of that level that are going out and they feel comfortable. They haven't studied the theological sciences. They don't have any degrees in the theological sciences, and they're going out there and they feel perfectly comfortable and at home calling the sitting Pope a heretic because they read something somewhere that's taken in the least charitable way possible, and a lot of times distorted in order to be able to condemn the Pope. It's like, what an example is? Have you ever been in an argument with somebody where you're of goodwill, or dialogue with somebody of goodwill, and they keep trying to impugn you? They keep trying to make it like you are the aggressor, and it's like, well, you say something, oh, you guys need to do this. Well, you're calling us you guys? And they have a problem with everything you say. That's what the trad world is so much right now with Pope Francis. And that's not to say there's not some legitimate problems. There are, and he's been loath to address them. He's perhaps too out of touch and not quick enough to be like, pastorally, I need to put my finger on this and put my finger in the hole in the dam, because there is an issue and it's causing some people scandal what's going on here. He's not doing that, but... Sorry, Simon. Go ahead.
I always enjoy listening to you, Dave. You always have these very good, solid takes to do, and I know that you stake out a position that is very, not opposed, but it's very different from kind of the trad media, and I really enjoy that. One of the things I think that is worthwhile saying is that many of these people who are coming out and making these statements in the Pope Francis is wrong. People come out and say Pope Francis is wrong, and then is he wrong to the point of heresy, wrong to the point of not being the Pope, or something like that? But Pope Francis is wrong. It's like, you yourself do not understand the issues in discussion. You're talking about them not having this, good theological grounding. I remember one of the first statements Pope Francis came out with as Pope Francis, and he said something like, we must not be obsessed with contraception, with abortion, with homosexuality. And suddenly the world blew up, because it was like, well, how does Pope Francis saying we shouldn't say that, abortion is wrong? It's like, no. the word obsessed means something. To be obsessed means to be dwelling on a thing more than is healthy. And that's, I mean, obsession is, you know, I think it's probably like some kind of sin. If you came along and said, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, I am obsessed with, doesn't matter what the thing is, I'm obsessed with coffee, I'm obsessed with bagatelle, you know, I'm what have you. That is not good. And certainly we should not be obsessed with these particular sins.
Same with, remember when he said you don't have to reproduce like rabbits? That's not the Catholic doctrine. 100% true. There is no thing, no command in the deposit of faith that says you have to have as many children as humanly possible. The church has always allowed for people to use, you know, the cycle of nature, which God has given us, that women are not always fertile, to, you know, responsibly and for just cause help govern the size of their families while deferring to God and leaving things open ultimately to his will. He was pot-shotted. So many people owe the Pope an apology about that.
So and he has, and just to clarify for those out there, he has recently come out and made very clear you cannot use contraception. It's intrinsically evil. He was very clear on that.
Yeah. Well, rabbits reproduce. There are, broadly speaking, there are two reproductive strategies in the natural world. There is the one used by creatures such as rabbits, which is where you make as many babies as possible because very few of them are going to survive to anything even approaching adulthood because of predators and dangerous environmental factors. There are some creatures that do this, and they just spawn hundreds and hundreds of babies. This is why rabbits took over Australia, because there are no natural predators, okay? Other reproductive strategy is you invest a huge amount of resources in a small number of children, and you protect them and you nurture them and you carry them to adulthood. This, surprisingly enough, is how humans do it. At that point,
we live in Detroit, so...
we live in Detroit, but...
Some people choose the former.
Some people choose the former, but you do not, as a human, the human strategy is not, let's just make as many babies as possible and throw them out into the wild and maybe some will survive. That is what reproduce like rabbits actually means from every single perspective. That is the thing that a kind of a biological chemist would say. I think he has a degree in chemistry.
Something that I've used several years ago for catechism to help people keep things separate, because everything's changing. They say, you know, we don't pray the rosary in our parish anymore, and, you know, priests might be getting married, and they're not wearing their habits, and, you know, all these different things. There's the 3 Ds, and to start off that, Fernandez himself recently in the Italian media, he came up with one of these Ds. He says, he's asked about priestly celibacy, okay, married priest. And he said, well, that's a prudential decision that the Pope must weigh. Actually, he's right about that. It's a discipline, not a doctrine, okay. Blessing same-sex couples, or let's just say couples having same-sex marriages, is a doctrinal thing. And that's going to be something where we're going to want to go for it in a minute, because that's problematic, where Fernandez wants to take that issue right there out of the doctrinal world and put it in a disciplinary world, which is kind of a slippery thing to do. But anyway, just sticking with the 3 Ds, boy can't marry boy, that's doctrine. Priest can marry girl and get ordained is a disciplinary thing. We don't do it in the West. I think biblically there's a case for why not in St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 7:32-33. St. Paul says, but I would have you to be without solicitude. He that is without a wife is solicitous for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please God. But he who is with the wife is solicitous for the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and he's divided. It's a very valid point. It's a vocation unto itself to be a husband and a father, and, you know, called out at 2 in the morning to go ahead and anoint somebody in the hospital, but, you know, it's your daughter's birthday that day, and, you know, I mean, there's all sorts of pulls here, and you're going to be compromised to a degree. So it was always quite the badge of honor to be an alter Christus, because, you know, a priest in the West who was not married, he had to lay that down. There was a sacrifice there. He had to set that aside. And all these virtues that would make you a good husband make you a good father. So it's not like, oh, you're priest material and you're husband material. No. You're manly material, and therefore you would make a good father, husband. You'd make a good father of a parish and, you know, husband of the church. So this idea that to lay that down, first of all, you're never going to have priests marry. You can't. Neither East nor West, never in 2,000 years did a priest marry. Whether you were ordained first, even as a deacon, never married after that. Whether you or your spouse died, you were married, you got ordained, and your spouse died, you never remarry, ever, as a priest. Because why? That's a higher vocation. Right there you see that you already have a higher vocation and you're not going to be taking on something else. A lower vocation, you might say, you know, in the Amazon Synod, you know, or the Amazonian jungles where you don't have all the priests down there. Maybe you do need a priest, and this guy's virtuous and he's the chieftain of the very, you know, he's married once and all that. And he could probably study up and become a priest there, and nobody else could do it. Okay, well, maybe you can ordain him. He's already married. But even in the East, Eastern Church, Catholic Church, when they do have someone, they have to be married first before they can. And I know a case back then when I was in the seminary. There was a, I'm not going to say his name, but a good chap. And he was getting nervous because his bishop's like, I'm waiting to ordain you, and you're not married yet. Oh, I'm still looking. Okay, so you're holding off on ordination so you can, you know, see if you can't get married in order to be ordained, because once you're ordained, even a deacon, you can't go back. So prudential decision is what the Pope is often, almost always about. Even that Abu Dhabi thing where he's saying, you know, God wills all religions, comes out to find, well, even Schneider would say, okay, you're not a heretic then. But the prudential decision that says, let's bless same-sex couples, I'm telling you that it's okay. I'm here as a priest saying God bless you all and all that. And Francis has met with same-sex couples with children and glad-handed with them. And, you know, where is that prudential judgment there that says, I'm going to leave you thinking that you're okay in your sin?
Well, here's the thing.
And that's on me.
You have to be, as a son of the church, as somebody lower in the hierarchy than the hierarchs of the hierarchy, you have to be able to say, no, I'm looking at this prudential decision, and it's objectively wrong. But I understand that you're not guaranteed in prudential decisions to always be objectively right. And this even goes for Amoris Laetitia, allowing the distribution of communion to the divorced and remarried. You know that's rife with abuse. And you know, at the same time, there are these little nuances where you can say, you know, you're actually not butchering doctrine on this, because in certain cases, you know, even if you're addicted to pornography, you're addicted to heroin, you have some compulsion where you are not absolutely free to sin, or free to a sufficient degree to sin mortally, then perhaps receiving the Eucharist, although you're in a disordered situation and you are in objective sin, it doesn't rise to the level of mortal sin, which would cut you off from the state of grace and not make you willing or able to receive the Eucharist. Even though there is that doctrinal nuance that could be added in, this is going to be abused. It's going to be abused. With blessing gay unions, there's no doctrinal nuance that can be added in. It's pure abuse. At the same time, the church isn't guaranteed to be impeccable, only infallible in faith and morals. So sometimes the applications, the syneidesis, not the synderesis, not the understanding of what the moral law is, but the application of the moral law to a particular set of circumstances, they'll be wrong. Look at what Pope Francis has done and said on the death penalty, where he's making a prudential judgment. They can be wrong in this case. So it's hard as the faithful to see something that's objectively wrong and be like, well, they were legitimately exercising their authority to do something objectively wrong by even under the banner of prudential judgment.
But you go back to St. John Chrysostom. He said in his day the majority of bishops are going to hell. I mean, that was in the 4th century. So the idea that bishops do make wrong decisions, and it's drastically wrong, and it sends them to hell. And he said the skull, you know, the hell is lined with paved with the skulls of bishops. My goodness, okay. And the Bishop of Rome, no exception. Read the Pageant of the Popes if you want to hear about all the bad popes in the past. None of those ages does anybody have a right to say, I'm leaving the church, I'm my own church, I'm my own magisterium, because there's a drunken sailor at the helm. Okay. Getting back to the 3 Ds, dogma, discipline, and devotions. You don't pray the rosary after Mass anymore. That's your devotion. That may have changed. Doesn't change the whole Holy Mother Church. You know what? You can still pray your rosary on the way to church or home. Discipline. If they start allowing priests to marry before they get ordained, that's something they can do. Prudentially, you don't have to agree with that. Even Ratzinger said, you don't have to agree with the Pope, John Paul II at the time, on his application of the death penalty. I don't agree with Pope Francis on the application of the death penalty. Fine. Benedict said, Pope Benedict, when he was Ratzinger, said you don't have to do that. In his letter to the American bishops but he said you can't be pro-abortion and receive communion. That does make you a bad bad Catholic. Chris Christie, using contraception make me bad Catholic?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
It does.
So that's the doctrine there. The dogma, you can't fudge on the dogma. And a lot of this discipline stuff, is there 6 precepts of the church or is there 5? But you know what? You still live the 10 commandments and the virtues and all that, and you're still going, 2,000 years, we had an arrow straight along, 2,000 years, no change. Keep following the arrow.
Yeah. Well, I think there's another thing that isn't just a question of is this aspect of the church, is it dogma, is it discipline, is it devotion, what is it? Is it, can I differ on it prudentially and da-da-da? I think there's another thing to look at. And the kind of example I'm going to use comes from one of my favorite books, which is Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. I've referenced this a bunch of times. People should read it. It's a very, very good book. But in there, the kind of background narrative to the story is this gradual escalation of hostilities between the Human Federation, the Terran Federation, and the bugs, the evil aliens who are attacking. And they are very dangerous and very nasty, and an example, an analogy for the communists. And in there, our hero remarks in the narrative, he says, I haven't really discussed how the Terran Federation went from peace to a state of concern, to a state of emergency, to a state of war, which it did during my basic training, because it wasn't really important to me. What Corporal Bronski thought of my haircut, that was important to me. What Sergeant Zim thought of my uniform, that was important to me. And this is the critical point, that when we talk about you as a Catholic, what is important to you? Is it what the Pope is doing? Or is it what your local priest is doing, what he is saying in his homily and the things he's calling you out? What your spiritual director is saying to you that you need to do? What your confessor is doing? And indeed what you are doing. If you want to go, okay, the Pope is engaging in this kind of behavior and the cardinals are doing this and saying that and being very confusing, okay, fine. But that's at a very elevated level. That is at the level of senators and politicians sitting there getting involved in a war. You are the little foot soldier. Is your footlocker in order? Are you committing sins that are probably objectively smaller than the sins you want to accuse Pope Francis of leading the entire flock of 1.2 billion people astray? Oh, fine, they are accusing Pope Francis of that. Are you leading one person astray? Are you leading 3 or 4 people astray? Your family? Are you yourself mired in some sin that is not as objectively bad as what has heresy or some terrible thing as this, but are you doing that? That is what is important. We need to bring it down smaller to us. And I think that's the thing that many of these people are just neglecting. It's all about, behold, look at what he's doing over there. Yeah, that's a distraction from your own sin.
Can I talk to the audience for a second? I think this needs to be said.
I think you've been talking to the audience the whole time.
Yeah,
sure, but more of a direct address here. It's that, we obviously respect you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's not in our benefit at Church Militant. It's not as profitable to go out there and be a sensationalist and grift and to get email addresses for all kinds of phony petitions and all the nonsense that you see that's endemic to the Catholic world. And I honestly think that people should be glad that we're not patronizing him. If you see a man who has no enemies or who is pandering or always has the same take, there's no nuances, it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't push you, it's because they're lying to you. It's because you're a pawn to them. So for all the people who respect our work here at Church Militant and who are tuning in, please support us, because it's hard to be where we're at, where we care about your soul enough to tell you the truth, and we're not going to patronize you, we're not going to talk down to you, we're going to give you the straight dope. Please support the apostolate and its ministry, because we have to compete against people who don't have scruples, who don't have integrity. That's all.
I'd like to also throw out there, St. John Eudes, about 1680 he died, so sometime before 1680, and he's a doctor of the church, so he's a smart guy, learned at the church. He said the most evident mark of God's anger and the most terrible castigation he can inflict upon the world are manifested when he permits his people to fall into the hands of clerics, not presidents, not senators, but clerics, church leaders and bishops, who are priests more in name than in deed. The greatest sign of his anger. So what we need to do, that's so common sense. What happened? Humanae Vitae comes along. 70% of the Catholics said, okay, well, I can do my own thing. I'm not going to listen to the Pope. That was 50 years ago. 50 years, those families who thumbed their nose at the papacy when you had Humanae Vitae, when it was clear, Pope Paul VI, laid it down there in 68, says you can't use contraception, and 70% of the Catholics or more said, oh yeah, we can. And you'll find some bishop, you'll start shopping. I remember back then, people shopped around. I'm not going to go to that father because he's going to tell me this. I'm going to go to this priest because he's telling me that. And then therefore I'm going to follow this. In your mind. So you got the same ambiguities. Now you do have the hippie priests have grown up to be hippie bishops now. And they were schooled to say, hey, go light on people, in the confessional on these things, specifically on contraception. We've covered it with the stories and documentaries on it. So 50 years, basically, we have now had generations of men coming from those homes, and who were part of those homes at the time, gone on to be Bidens and gone on to be Fernandezes and other people who, just go along to get along and can be fuzzy and all that. And even think that maybe confusion's a good way to just gin up conversation as a pastoral approach. I know some good bishops who said Pope Francis wants the confusion, and they were good bishops, and not being uncharitable. Said he just wants it because that's going to get people talking about it anyway. So I don't agree with that necessarily. It's a scandal to allow scandal out there just to get people talking about it. But it may be his method. So we have to give God less reasons to give ourselves bad pastors. We need to get back in the family, get back to having good vocations again, and so forth. So, God bless St. John Eudes. Thanks for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Now please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo et spes nostra salve. A te clamamus, exules filii Eve. A te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, ilos tuos misericordes oculos, ad nos converte, et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende, o clemens, o pia, o dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you again for joining us for The Download. We premiere a new episode like this every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. From all of us here at Church Militant, God bless you.